With the perpetual decline of freedom in Canada, can we even say that we're free anymore? A lot of people will say that this is because Trudeau broke Canada, but how true is that? Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be discussing the rapidly deteriorating state of our rights and freedoms in Canada, not just as they pertain to firearms, but the problem as a whole. Now I want to start by showing you a quick video. Earlier this year, Pierre Poilievre uploaded this video to his YouTube channel.
But when he says that Canada is broken, that's where we draw the line. Canada is not broken.
Here's the good news, my friends. Life was not like this before Justin Trudeau, and it won't be like this after he's gone.
Now, a lot of people like to blame Trudeau for the problems in Canada, and he is certainly much of the problem. However, I think the issue runs much deeper than that. This is a problem which has existed in Canada for decades and has been backed up by countless court rulings. A problem which many governments have noticed, latched onto, and even exploited. It's something which sounds innocent enough, or maybe even sounds like a good idea when it's said out loud, but it is catastrophic when it's analyzed, or even worse when it's put into practice. It's also something which Trudeau has taken significant notice of.
Speaker, our top priority on this side of the House is always the safety of our communities. This may be a first step, it may be the only step we need to take, but every step of the way we're going to be making sure we're keeping Canadians safe. We're in a situation where, first and foremost, the priority of any Canadian government needs to be to keep Canadians safe.
The problem is both he and the courts place public safety above freedom in terms of their respective values to society. Now, apart from the obvious problem, that this creates a terrible reward system, I also think this problem needs significant detailing for most people to understand why safety is such a poor system of values for the government to anchor onto. After all, we would all love to be safe from harm of any kind, so what's the problem if the government promotes that as their core value? Well, first off, and perhaps most importantly, if safety is more important than freedom, then it is rewarding for a government to make the world a more dangerous place. With this value system, if a government wishes to gain more power, influence, and perhaps even to exert tyranny, all they have to do is to ensure that the world becomes a more dangerous place. Danger, which they can then protect us from. If you take a look at Trudeau's approach to violent crime, he has done this intentionally and overtly by reducing jail times for firearm offenses, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences for many types of violent crimes, and making bail significantly easier to get for repeat violent offenders. All of these policies have caused a surge of crime in Canada in recent years, which has allowed him and other politicians to enact draconian policies and laws in order to solve a problem that he appears to have intentionally created in order to procure this very outcome. But the problem is more insidious than even that. When safety is more important than freedom, danger isn't even really the threshold. Fear is the true threshold. I'm going to provide many examples of this, but we're going to start with the gun control conversation.
And this is about freedom. People should be free to go to the supermarket, their school, or their place of worship without fear. In Canada, whether it's at the park, at the mosque, at school, at a sports parade, in a small town, in a big city, or in your own home, no one should ever have to be afraid.
To ensure that every Canadian feels safe in their community, we must take a comprehensive approach.
If you look at gun control bills C-21, C-71, and the so-called assault-style firearms ban, OIC of 2020, there was and is very little empirical evidence to suggest that they were wholly necessary actions. Nor was there any evidence that they would do more good than harm. There wasn't even any conclusive evidence to suggest that their measures would provide any actual safety benefit at all. But despite all that, Trudeau and his government has spent years telling everyone that they are in danger from all these scary guns, especially the black scary guns, and that the only way for you and your children to be safe is to vote for him so that he can persecute the minority group called firearms owners, and to take away their rights, freedoms, and culture from them. This is an oversimplification, of course, but that is essentially the message. which is why legislating based on the criteria of safety is so disastrous. Danger can be quite difficult to prove, but fear is incredibly easy to manufacture.
And Canadians certainly don't need assault-style weapons that were designed to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. Military-style assault weapons that were designed to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. Weapons designed to kill the largest number of people as quickly as possible.
Despite the fact that we are statistically much less likely than the general public to commit crimes of any kind, not just violent crimes, Trudeau and the media have successfully brainwashed much of the public into believing that we are to be detested, vilified, or that we're a bunch of evil extremists simply for wanting our rights and freedoms to be protected from government overreach. That our mere existence is a public safety crisis for Canadians.
Gun violence is a complex problem, but at the end of the day, the math is really quite simple. The fewer the guns in our communities, the safer everyone will be.
A crisis to which he says the only solution is for us to hand over more of our freedom to him in exchange for some false promise of safety. A crisis he intentionally manufactured in order to procure this very outcome, and it's freedom that we may never get back. And we saw this in his treatment of the Great Coughing Plague not so long ago, where he obliterated all semblance of rights and freedoms in this country for several years, all in the name of public safety. He declared that people could not go outside, or work, or socialize, or even provide food and shelter for their families unless they obeyed his arbitrage rules of safety, which, by the way, included invasive procedures regarding injections of largely untested drugs. Now, I do want to be clear here. This isn't about the drugs. I am not an anti-vaxxer. I'm vaccinated and I did so willingly. I have my own reasons for doing so, and I will continue to likely do so in the future. What this is actually about is how people were legally prohibited from earning money unless they complied with his decrees of so-called safety. In our society, money is realistically the only way for most people at scale to acquire food, clothes, and shelter. Saying that people are not allowed to earn money unless they comply with government orders is literally no different than saying that people cannot independently provide for their own basic human needs without government approval. This independence is even supposedly protected by Section 7 of the Charter. A Supreme Court ruling in Section 7 says that you have the liberty of personal autonomy involving inherently private choices that go to the core of what it means to enjoy dignity and independence. Not being required to have forced medical injections in order to eat is maybe the most inherently independent and private choice there is. Like, it's bizarre that this is something which even needs to be said out loud, let alone something which actually happened in a supposedly free society on a national scale. This is even explicitly covered in another Supreme Court case. This aspect of liberty includes the right to refuse medical treatment and the right to make reasonable medical choices without threat of criminal prosecution. Yet, despite all this, the government coerced Canadians in choosing between their essential needs and exercising their own liberty as outlined in Section 7 of the Charter. During this time, government tyranny was absolute, and they did it all in the name of public safety. And then, after 2 years of living under absolute tyrannical rule, people had had enough. They drove to Ottawa, gathered in protest, and demanded their rights and freedoms back. For over a month they were there, and for over a month, Trudeau and his media told the country to hate and fear them.
The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing. Freedom of expression, assembly, and association are cornerstones of democracy. But Nazi symbolism.
Mais il y a aussi des gens qui sont farouchement opposés à la vaccination. Qui sont extrémistes. Qui croient pas dans la science, qui sont souvent misogynes, souvent racistes. Et là, il faut faire un choix en tant que leader, en tant que pays. Est-ce qu'on tolère ces...
He called them racists, misogynists, extremists. He even called them Nazis.
I did not call people who were unvaccinated names.
He then went so far as to declare them a threat to the security of Canada by invoking the Emergencies Act. And all of these egregious lies were told, according to him, in the name of public safety.
What if the worst had happened in those following days? What if someone had gotten hurt?
There was, objectively, no threat or danger to be had from this protest. And this was proven in court beyond any doubt and upheld by Justice Mosley. Which means his decrees were, again, unconstitutional. However, proof or danger of harm wasn't required in order to actually invoke the Emergencies Act. Fear of perceived danger was all that was needed. Artificial fear, which was once again intentionally manufactured by Trudeau to grant himself these powers.
The responsibility of a prime minister is to make the tough calls and keep people safe. And my job throughout this was to keep Canadians safe.
And more recently, we've also seen freedom of expression being eradicated in Canada. Among others, Bills C11, C18, and now even Bill C63 are directly aimed at stomping out this very basic and essential charter right in Canada. And this may be the most severe and obvious infringement on our rights since the charter was signed in 1982. And yet again, we see the so-called justification for these infringements to be in the name of public safety. He has very intentionally tied the anti-free speech laws with attempts to eliminate CP online. Anytime anyone criticizes him on the matter, he responds that the entire bill is necessary to keep children safe, despite the fact that only a minor fraction of the bill is actually designed to do so. This has created a narrative where opposing his obvious attempts at tyranny are tantamount to supporting CP. This is a blatant form of divisive politics designed to create fear and contempt towards anyone who doesn't agree with stopping CP at any cost. And this is a prime example of how Trudeau has earned the honor of being dubbed the most divisive prime minister in history. He has weaponized the term public safety to sow division through hate and fear in order to get him anything he wants, anytime he wants, for any reason he wants. And here's the thing. Section 1 of the Charter shouldn't let him do it. But its warped interpretation by the courts is intentionally designed to encourage this behavior. Now, I call it a warped interpretation because if you actually read the letter of the law laid out in the Charter, it makes no mention of public safety being more important than freedom. It doesn't even mention safety at all. It says it permits only reasonable limits which can be justified in a free and democratic society. This has been interpreted by politicians and the court to say that your right and freedoms can be suspended or eliminated in the name of a greater societal good. But that is not what Section 1 of the Charter actually says. What this says, very expressly, is that the prerequisite requirement of any proposed limitation is that it must still respect both freedom and democracy. Placing fear, or even danger, above freedom invalidates the Section 1 rule of freedom. Now, most people don't understand this concept on its surface, or don't think it's such a big deal, or don't really understand why it's a problem. So consider this instead. Section 1 actually has two parts. Suppose we take a look at the other Section 1 prerequisite of democracy. If Trudeau wanted to permanently suspend elections in Canada and officially become the dictator that he's always dreamed of being, could he do it? Of course not. But here's the thing. What if he said he was going to do it in the name of public safety? Suppose that he said he was doing it in order to reduce gun violence. I mean, after all, Conservatives have publicly said that they will repeal his gun control measures, measures which Trudeau insists are for public safety. So therefore, it is logically consistent that the Conservatives, and as a result, democracy itself, have become a threat to public safety. Could he destroy democracy in order to achieve the goal of public safety? I mean, hopefully not. So why then can he destroy freedom in the name of public safety? Why is democracy given such reverence and freedom is treated so trivially? Freedom and democracy are the pillars of our society as laid out in Section 1, not just democracy. Section 1 says we are to protect both. Freedom and democracy are the pillars of our society as laid out in Section 1, not just democracy. In my view, it is not reasonable to put safety above freedom, and there is even court precedent to back up my claim. If we take a look at precedent as explained during the Emergencies Act ruling, Justice Mosley had this to say. The court must respect Parliament's drafting choices and cannot amend the statute as it sees fit. It also goes on to say that the government may be the ultimate decision-making authority, but it only has the power conferred on it by the Constitution, statute, and the common law. And finally, in paragraph 287, it says, the court cannot rewrite the statute and has to take the definition as it reads. What this all means is that the government and the courts must interpret Section 1 as it reads, and not as how they want it to read. It clearly says it permits limits which can only be justified so long as freedom remains. Limits which are justified by freedom, not justifications to limit freedom. And to show just how absolute the deference given to public safety is, this is a part of a recent ruling handed down late last year by a judge regarding the CCFR's legal challenge to the 2020 firearm OIC bans. This is a decision which is also currently being appealed. So Justice Kane said, if the court found that the regulations infringed on Section 7 in a manner not in accordance with principles of fundamental justice, The court would find that any infringement is justified pursuant to Section 1 of the Charter as a reasonable limit. The overriding goal of public safety outweighs any possible infringement to the rights of firearms owners. What this means is that even if we met not just our personal thresholds of what we think is an unfair or unjust limitation on our liberty, but even the constitutionally enshrined legal threshold of something being an unfair or unjust limitation on our liberty, it would not matter because public safety is more important than justice or our rights or our freedoms. Rulings like these are commonplace in Canadian precedent as a direct result of the perverted interpretation of Section 1. So this bears repeating. Section 1 of the Charter of our Rights and Freedoms does not say our rights and freedoms are to be limited in a safe and democratic society. It says a free and democratic society.
The primary responsibility of a prime minister is to keep Canadians safe and alive.
So, because of how much power it gives to the government, public safety is no longer a term offering protections for Canadians, but rather it is a term of oppression over Canadians. It sets such a low bar that it allows any Canadian government almost limitless authority to subvert your rights and freedoms in any way they see fit, provided they say the magical words of public safety. Which leads us to the fundamental problem here. Safety cannot be permitted to be more important than freedom. If it is, then freedom can't exist. This is something we all know to be true, but somehow most have forgotten. If you take a look at nearly every large-scale societal breakthrough in history which was done in the name of freedom, it has almost always come at a very high price to safety. Ripping down monarchies has caused significant death tolls. Abolishing slavery resulted in wars in many countries. World War II, to stop a country hell-bent on eradicating certain groups of people, resulted in the deaths of over 50 million people. There can be no doubt that it was freedom and not safety that these people were after. It is unquestionable that we would not be free in our current day and age if our ancestors did not give up their safety in order to secure it. We live in such relative freedom today that it can be really hard for us to even imagine. We take our freedom for granted. After all, what's the harm in trading it for a little bit of safety? Well, our ancestors were people just like you and me. They were not so different from us, and we are not so different from them. Yet we know that they gladly traded their safety if only for a chance at freedom. In nearly every instance in history where the oppressed had the opportunity to fight for their freedom, they seized it. Even when it meant the possibility of death. Even if it meant the probability of death. But all we have to do to fight for our freedom is to just not throw it away. We might not be able to comprehend just how important it is, but we can look to the example they set for us. Now, it's not like we shouldn't consider safety at all in our society. The only time we should be putting public safety ahead of freedom is where the end result is more freedom than we would have originally had. Where safety is a function of enhancing freedom. And a good example of this in our society is prison. Prison is very clearly a concept completely opposed to freedom. However, if you have a correctly structured and functioning justice system, something which Canada doesn't appear to have, then prison is entirely justified in a free society because it actually enhances the freedom of the law-abiding and permits most good people to live freer and better lives than if it didn't exist at all. Prison is also an excellent example of why we should not place absolute safety above any level of freedom. Even in a place as restrictive as prison, a place without any real freedom, people still have enough freedom to cause each other harm. Assaults and sometimes even murders happen in prison. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that we can't live in a world where everyone is completely safe and where no one is ever hurt, but to live in such a world would evidently require restrictions on our freedom more severe than even those we place on prisoners. And these extreme restrictions would need to be placed on people who never have and never will do anything wrong. So either we need to give up all freedom in order to be completely safe, or at some point we need to stop this reckless and delusional pursuit of safety if we wish to preserve freedom. So how do we do it? How do we convince the masses that our freedoms are more important than protecting us from fear or danger? But here's the thing. We shouldn't need to. It's already been decided for us in the Constitution. It's not supposed to be up for debate. Section 1 of the Charter says that we must preserve freedom and democracy as our core values. All other laws and limitations are secondary to those two ideals. Now, I want to make something clear here. Outlawing harmful behavior is a completely valid exercise of government power. Actions like assault or murder should be outlawed even in a free society. But public safety is not the same thing. Public safety has become the idea of protection from all danger not just protection from harmful actions. And a quick and lazy example to understand this distinction would be skydiving. Skydiving is certainly dangerous. There's always the chance that something goes wrong and you go splat, but the only way to guarantee that nothing ever goes wrong while skydiving, and thereby eliminate all of the danger posed by skydiving, is to outlaw skydiving entirely. Now this would be wrong because it's a violation of your freedom to impose such laws. However, mandating that you bring a parachute with you and that you know how to use it if you want to go skydiving is entirely justified. And that's because skydiving without a parachute isn't dangerous, it's harmful. It's not the possibility of harm, it's the certainty of harm. Mandating parachutes allows people to continuously engage in their freedom without any undue risk to themselves or others. And this example, while, a little basic, shows very clearly where the line is for the government to respect. From the perspective of public safety, there is no distinction between fear or danger or harm. But from the perspective of freedom, danger is a constant and only harm is what should be avoided. Or, in other words, safety in exchange for freedom is nothing other than tyranny. However, safety for the sake of freedom is still freedom. And this is why freedom, and not safety, must be the chief value in a free and democratic society. And this is, again, what Section 1 of the Charter actually says. Placing public safety above freedom is not a reasonable limit because evidently it permits absolute tyranny as well as a complete eradication of all of our rights and freedoms if you give that power to the wrong government. Which, if the last few decades are of any indication, is every Canadian government to some extent and not just the extreme overreaches of our current one. However, placing freedom above safety does not preclude legislation or regulations based on safety for the sake of enhancing freedom. Safety-focused legislation is innately imbalanced and always will be. But freedom-focused legislation is not and never can be. The government seems to have forgotten what their job is. It is not their job to guarantee everyone's safety. That's just not possible. And as I've shown, it's certainly not even remotely attainable if we wish to remain free. The government's job should be public order, not public safety. Now, there's often significant overlap between the two, but they're not at all the same thing.
The act compelled tow truck companies to remove big rigs blocking streets, and banks to freeze $8 million in funds from nearly 300 accounts. Police were given more powers, something civil liberties groups questioned Trudeau on.
We were very clearly saying that we need to restore enforcement of the law and we need to restore public order.
Trudeau was also asked about the risk that his unprecedented move could make it easier for future governments to use the Emergencies Act.
And this is where our rights come into play. A mandate of public order could definitely still result in absolute government tyranny, but our rights are supposed to exist to limit how much control they can exert to this end. Or, at least it should. However, our court's perverted interpretation of the Charter allows the government to override these rules and protections almost entirely on a whim. So why is this all so crucial? Well, we've seen what 9 years of an ideological focus on public safety can give us. In the name of so-called public safety, Canadians have become more stressed than ever, poorer than ever, less free than ever, and, perhaps ironically, less safe than ever. And that's right. Even with a seemingly fanatical approach to public safety, violent crime numbers have skyrocketed, life expectancy is down, and birth rates are also at their lowest in recorded history. So not only do we need to place freedom as the pinnacle of virtue in our society for the sake of maintaining our rights and freedoms, but evidently, we also need to do it for the sake of safety. The statistical reality is, if we force the government to focus on freedom, we can actually get both. But if we let the government focus on the comfortable lie of public safety, we actually get neither. So, did Trudeau break Canada? Honestly? In my opinion, not really. He has certainly caused it significant and perhaps irreparable harm. Harm which will take years or probably even decades to undo if it ever happens at all. But no, he didn't break Canada. He is merely exploiting what was already a broken system. As crazy as Canada has become under his rule, this is Canada more or less working as intended. The Charter, or more specifically the court's perverted interpretations of the Charter, has been broken from the start. An interpretation which allows fear or danger to be valued over freedom is an interpretation which does not value freedom. Public safety is only one of the many ways the government has the authority to limit your rights and freedoms on a whim, but to me it is possibly the most important flaw in our system. And this is a system which will continue to be broken so long as the courts allow our charter rights and freedoms to be so callously trampled on by something as trivial and unattainable as public safety. Our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom should not be subject to the whims or morals of whoever happens to be in power at the time. And if it is, then it's nothing more than a charter of suggestions and nice ideas. So long as our freedom is even so much as up for debate, then we are not truly free. So, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Do you agree with what I've said? And what other ways do you think Canada limits your freedoms? Perhaps maybe you even think I'm overreacting. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. My channel is still small enough that I will read and respond to most of the comments. So if you have concerns, criticisms, or suggestions, please put them in the comment section down below, and I'd love to take a look at them. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.